Hello, my name is Steve O'Reilly, and this is Roma Locuta Est Considers. This is a production of RomaLocutaEst.com. And what is RomaLocutaEst.com? You may well ask yourself. Well, it's a wee, humble blog that the world little notes, nor will it long remember, but it is devoted to apologetics and commentary on Catholic topics, current events, and general Christian apologetics. We do not seek, nor do we accept any donations. No funding is received from any other source. We're beholden to no one, and we alone are responsible for the content. This is episode 9 of Roma Locuta Est Considers, and today we continue our look at Benepapism, and specifically we're looking at Pope Benedict's last general audience, and this is part 2 of a two-part series where we look at the famous paragraph that begins, "The always is also a forever." Okay, so being this is part 2, we're going to assume that folks have followed along and seen part 1. So I'll just get right into continuing my response to the objections leveled by the Benepapists. But just as a quick recap, this is the famous paragraph that the Benepapists will look at, and then pointing at it, they'll say, see here, Benedict said that he believed that the papacy left an indelible mark, that he'll always remain Pope. So let's just take a quick look at that paragraph. So you have Benedict saying, the always is also a forever. There can no longer be a return to the private sphere. My decision to resign the active exercise of the ministry does not revoke this. I do not return to the private life, to a life of travel or meetings, receptions, conferences, and so on. I am not abandoning the cross, but remaining in a new way, at the side of the crucified Lord. I no longer bear the power of office for the governance of the Church, but in the service of prayer I remain, so to speak, in the enclosure of St. Peter. St. Benedict, whose name I bear as Pope, will be a great example for me in this. He showed us the way for a life which, whether active or passive, is completely given over to the work of God. So that's the paragraph. And from that paragraph, there's 3 basic objections that the Benepapists make. The first objection is the always is also forever is a reference to an indelible mark of the papacy in Benedict's mind. So Benedict is saying that, according to the Benepapist, Benedict's saying the always is also forever is referencing his belief that somehow the papacy leaves an indelible mark. So obviously if it leaves an indelible mark on him, then there's no way he can be rid of the papacy, so to speak, even if he resigns. So that is one of the errors they say he made. Then the second objection is there's a line where Benedict says, my decision to resign the active exercise of the ministry does not revoke this. So that is to say, the Benepapists say, the indelibility of the papal ministry is irrevocable. Benedict thinks he is Pope forever, but he will now exercise only a part of the Petrine ministry. So again here the objection is that he believes Benedict, in his mind, believes his resignation does not revoke this indelible mark, and that when he speaks of resigning the active exercise, he's kind of qualifying his resignation from the ministry. So he's giving up the active part of the papacy, but somehow he believes there's a passive or contemplative part of the papacy which he's retaining. And the third objection is the Benepapists say Benedict believed he could give up the power of jurisdiction with the active exercise of the munus, kind of like what I just said. Thus he can say, I no longer bear the power of the office for the governance of the Church or for the Church. Yet at the same time, Benedict believed he would maintain the power of order, and thus could immediately add in his audience here, saying, but in the service of prayer I remain, so to speak, in the enclosure of St. Peter. So those are the 3 major objections. Okay, we've seen the rejection, so now I will continue my reply. Again, I started replying in part 1, so now I will continue, and here we'll get directly into the general audience. Okay, so we're looking at the general audience of Benedict XVI. He gave this audience on Wednesday, February 27th, 2013. So we'll be looking, we won't go line by line in the text, folks. I encourage you to read it, but we'll take out some highlights of, I think, what the major themes are of the audience. Overall, I would say before we get into looking more closely at the general audience, it is I think, a beautiful reflection. Unfortunately, the Benepapists, making what they have of it, have mangled it and warped its beauty. And I suggest people actually take a look at it, because I think it is a fond farewell from Benedict saying goodbye, but also in a way saying I'm not going, but not in the sense that the Benepapists would like to think. So briefly, the beginning portions of the general audience, as is most appropriate, Benedict begins by thanking God. So he says that in various places. I won't linger on this too long, but he talks about it, and he begins here saying, I think we should also say thanks to the Creator for the fine weather. So he's thanking God for the beautiful weather. I think this was given outside in St. Peter's Square. He goes on a little bit later, I thank God for all that I've heard in these years of the Petrine ministry about the faith of the Lord Jesus Christ, and the love which truly circulates in the body of the church and makes it live in love, and about the hope which opens and directs us towards the fullness of life and towards our heavenly homeland. Further on he goes, as I have often said, the words which echoed in my heart were, Lord, what are you asking of me? This is when he was first elected, so he's asking the Lord in the beginning, what are you asking of me? What is it that you are asking of me to do? And then he goes on, though he had these fears, he goes on to say, but I have always known that the Lord is in that boat, and I have always known that the bark of the church is not mine, but his. And so he goes on to say, for this reason, my heart today overflows with gratitude to God, for he has never left his church or me personally lack, or me personally lack his consolation, his light, his love. For this reason, my heart today overflows with gratitude to God, for he has never let his church or me personally lack his consolation, his light, his love. So actually, a repeat of what I just said above. Then he adds down here, I want everyone to feel loved by God, who gave his Son for us and who has shown us his infinite love. I want everyone to feel the joy of being a Christian. In one beautiful morning prayer, it says, I adore you, my God, and I love you with all my heart. I thank you for having created me and having made me a Christian. Okay, so he concludes by saying here, in terms of thanking God, but it's not only God whom I want to thank in this moment. And this moment is his goodbye to the papacy. But he goes on to thank several groups of categories of people. We won't linger on these in great detail, but he thanks the cardinals, he thanked the Secretary of State, the Roman Curia, all those or any of those who served the Holy See in some ways. That would be lay people who worked at the Holy See. The Church of Rome, his diocese as Bishop of Rome. He thanks my brother bishops in the episcopate. He thanks his fellow priests. He thanks consecrated persons. And then finally, he thanks the entire people of God. And then he continues his, I think, again, his beautiful reflection. He talks about the great kindness and deep affection he's felt from the entire people of God. Then he goes on to say, yet I too have felt affection for each and all, without distinction. And we'll get to that. That's going to be a theme as we get further and closer to the always is also forever. That's important to remember. I too have felt affection for each and all without distinction, and with pastoral charity, which is the heart of every pastor, and especially of the Bishop of Rome, the successor of the Apostle Peter, every day I have borne each of you in prayer with the heart of a father. So here he says he's borne us all in prayer, and he does so with the heart of a father. And that's, again, I think, an important theme to remember as we get to the always is also a forever. Then Benedict goes on to talk about, again, this is in the lead up to his resignation, or the effective date of his resignation on the 28th of February. He speaks of all the wishers he's had, letters and cards and so forth that he's received from people throughout the world in recent weeks, have sent me moving expressions of concern, friendship, and prayer. And he says here, yes, the Pope is never alone. And that's, again, that's a theme we're going to see that's important as we get to the always is also forever. The Pope is never alone. And now once again experience this so overwhelmingly that my heart is touched. The Pope belongs to everyone, and so many persons feel very close to him. Again, a very relational statement to people. The church is not just some abstract thing. He's talking about individuals. He's never alone. He feels their love, and he belongs to everyone. And that's, again, a theme that we're going to see very shortly. So in his audience here, Benedict, again, still speaking of the entire people of God, he speaks about how he has been receiving cards and letters, expressions of love and affection from the entire people of God. He says they don't write to me as if I'm some prince or some important person who they do not know. They write to me as brothers and sisters, as sons and daughters, with a sense of very affectionate family bond. And again, this is key, that these themes here of brothers and the church as brothers and sisters to him and sons and daughters and a family bond is very important to understand, as we'll see. The meaning of the always is also a forever. And here Benedict goes on to describe the church. Here, again, this is Benedict speaking here, one can sense palpably what the church is, not an organization, an association for religious or humanitarian ends, but a living body, a communion of brothers and sisters in the body of Christ, which makes us all one. So again, he's speaking not of some abstract organization that's kind of out there. He's speaking of the church as a family, which it is. He spoke earlier of having a heart of a father. He spoke here of a very affectionate family bond with the brothers and sisters, his sons and daughters. And I think these are important things to keep in mind as we go on to look at the always is also a forever. So I think you begin to see in the structure of Benedict's last audience. I mean, he thanks God for all he has done for Benedict as a pope. He has thanked the various categories of persons that have helped him in his papacy, from the cardinals all the way down to the people of God. He spoke about having a heart of a father for the church, for his sons and daughters, his brothers and sisters, and saying what a loving relationship he has with the church. It's a living communion, living body, living communion of brothers and sisters and sons and daughters. So people might start asking. You can see where he's trying to head off the question, which is, hey, you're saying all this, you say you love us, but you're leaving us. What's up with that? And that's what Benedict gets to next. And that leads us into where Benedict then speaks about his decisioning process for why he's leaving, why he's resigning. In these last months, I have felt my energies declining. I've asked God insistently in prayer to grant me his light and to help me make the right decision, not for my own good, but for the good of the church. I have taken this step with full awareness of its gravity and even in its novelty, but with profound and interior serenity. Loving the church, again, remember, he thinks of the church not just some abstract thing. It's his brothers and sisters, his sons and daughters. Loving the church means also having the courage to make difficult, painful decisions, always looking to the good of the church and not for oneself. So here he's with the heart of the Father saying, I'm making this decision out of love for you guys, for my sons and daughters, brothers and sisters. Okay, so he said he made a tough, loving the church means he had to make a tough decision. And here in the very next paragraph, he gets into that. So here he says, here, allow me to go back again to 19 April 2005. Okay, that's the date he was elected Pope. He goes on to say, the real gravity of the decision, and the decision he's referring to is his decision to resign, was also due to the fact that from that moment on, I was engaged always and forever by the Lord. So here we see the appearance of the always and the forever. This is the paragraph before the famous always is also a forever. But the Benepapists generally do not look at this paragraph at all, and if they had done so and looked at it with greater detail, they would see that their argument or their explanation of the always is also forever is just dead wrong. So Benedict says again that the real gravity of the decision was also due to the fact that from that moment on, I was engaged always and forever by the Lord. So the question is here, what he says he was engaged by the Lord always and forever, but what does he mean by that? Does it mean what the Benepapists say? Does that mean that he received an indelible mark of the papacy, suggested by Mark Doherty, as we saw in part 1? He speaks of being engaged by the Lord always and forever by the Lord. What does he mean by always and forever? Well, he goes on and he will tell us. Again, up here he says, I was engaged always and forever by the Lord. So what does he mean? Well, Benedict defines his terms. He begins with always, right here, very next sentence, always, hyphen. So what does he mean? He tells us right here, anyone who accepts the Petrine ministry no longer has any privacy. Doesn't say anything about an indelible mark. He's talking about not having any privacy. And what does he mean by that? Well, he tells us he belongs always and completely to everyone, to the whole church. And that again refers back to what you said earlier about the pastoral charity, that he has a heart of a father for the church. And the Pope, he said earlier in the audience that the Pope is never alone. So that's why he says here, in a manner of speaking, the Pope, he says here, in a manner of speaking, the private dimension of his life, of a Pope's life, is completely eliminated. I mean, he's never alone. He belongs always and completely to everyone, to the whole church. But then he goes on and says a little bit more. So he goes on to say a little bit more, Benedict does. So he just spoke about the private dimension of his life is, in a manner of speaking, completely eliminated. He goes on to say, I was able to experience, and I experience it even now, that one receives one's life precisely when one gives it away. Earlier, I said that many people who love the Lord also love the successor of St. Peter and feel great affection for him. That the Pope truly has brothers and sisters, sons and daughters throughout the world, and that he feels secure in the embrace of your communion because he no longer belongs to himself, he belongs to all, and all belong to him. So he's not speaking of an indelible mark on his soul. He's speaking of a bond of charity. That when he became Pope, he became, had the heart of the Father. Everyone became a son and daughter to him, or a brother and sister. And again, we know how he described the church as, again, not some abstract thing out there. It's no, the church is a living body, a communion of brothers and sisters, of his sons and daughters. So he's speaking with the heart of a father about a family bond. He is not talking about some indelible mark of the papacy. He's talking about a relationship that he took on when he became Pope. And we can see some of these same themes pop up in earlier writings or homilies given by Benedict when he was Cardinal Ratzinger back in 1979, I think it was. He gave a homily, I think just only a few days after the death of Pope Paul VI. And speaking of Pope Paul VI in his homily, speaking of him, he says, moreover, we can imagine how heavy the thought must be for a Pope of no longer belonging to ourselves. You belong to others. We just saw him talking about that, belonging to others and all belonging to you, and of no longer having a single private moment. So he's not talking about an indelible mark of the papacy. He's talking about a relational thing. When you become Pope, you now become a father to others. You're just no longer, Joseph Ratzinger. You become the Holy Father to a whole church. You have brothers and sisters now. You have sons and daughters who you have this kind of bond of charity with. That's what he's referring to. And again, during the homily of the Mass, which inaugurated his papacy, which was the Mass of the imposition of the pallium and conferral of the fisherman's ring for the beginning of the Petrine ministry of the Bishop of Rome, Benedict said at one point in his homily, "I am not alone. I do not have to carry alone what is in truth I could never carry alone. All the saints of God are there to protect me, to sustain me, to carry me. And your prayers, my dear friends, your indulgence, your love, your faith, and your hope accompany me." So even if that's the point, he's lost his privacy. He's not alone anymore. He's not alone doing this. He does have the church, his brothers and sisters, his sons and daughters who are praying for him. So he's speaking of a bond of charity between he and the church as people, not as an abstraction, and the church as people having that same bond back towards him. That is what he is talking about. There is no talk of an indelible mark of the papacy here. Okay, so having gone through, we just looked at this paragraph right here, this one here that I'm marking and circling. We just looked at that, and up there, Benedict first brought up being engaged by the Lord always and forever, and we just looked at how Benedict explains and explicates what he means by the always. He talks about a loss of privacy. That has to do with the belonging to all and all to him. And so again, we know that always is a bond of charity. So what about the forever? Well, in the very next paragraph, Benedict begins by saying the always, which he just explained right up here, the always is also a forever. There can no longer be a return to the private sphere. Now in Italian, it just says I think privato or privata, so it's really just return to privacy. The always is also forever. There can be no return to the private sphere, he says. So here he is equating always. Up here was a explanation involving the loss of privacy, taking on a relationship, and down here he's saying the always is also a forever. There can be no longer be returned to the private sphere. So again, he's still talking about privacy. He's still talking about the bond of charity. He is not talking about an indelible mark of the papacy. Okay, so the always is also a forever. There could no longer be a return to the private sphere. So both the always and the forever have something to do with what Benedict is talking about in terms of this privacy thing, the loss of privacy. And in the prior paragraph up here, we saw what he meant, what he means by that, what he's getting at. Always, anyone who accepts the Petrine ministry no longer has any privacy. What does he mean by that? Well, he belongs always and completely to everyone, to the whole church. And we saw that in his homily regarding St. Paul. He goes on to say, in a manner of speaking, the private dimension of his life is completely eliminated. I was able to experience, and I experience it even now, that when one receives one's life precisely when one gives it away. I earlier said that many people who love the Lord and also love the successor of St. Peter feel a great affection for him, that the Pope truly has brothers, sons and daughters throughout the world, and he feels secure in the embrace of your communion because he no longer belongs to himself. So that's his loss of privacy. I don't belong to myself as Pope. That's what he's saying. Or in my life that I've had here, I no longer belong to myself. He belongs to all, and all belong to him. So he's, again, speaking of a bond of charity. And nothing could be clearer. Okay, so now we move on to the second sentence of the famous paragraph cited by the Benepapists. We just read the always is also a forever. There could no longer be a return to the private sphere. We see that that is a statement about his bond of charity for the church as a living communion of sons and daughters and brothers and sisters. And so he goes on to say, my decision to resign the active exercise of the ministry does not revoke this. So understanding now what the always and the forever is, referring to a bond of charity, we can understand clearly what he's saying here. My decision to resign does not revoke my bond of charity towards you guys, towards you, the church, towards you, my sons and daughters, to you, my brothers and sisters. I'm resigning, but it's not like I just kind of walk away and kind of say, I don't love you guys anymore, so long, and that's it. No, he's saying that my decision to resign does not revoke this bond of charity. He's saying I still carry it with me. Again, he spoke earlier of having the heart of a father, of a family bond, even though his responsibilities have come to an end as head of the church on earth. He is still going to remember this bond of charity. That is all he is saying here. We will look at, now the Benepapist will also here focus on his use of the active exercise of the ministry to suggest that he is bifurcating the papacy into an active part and a passive part. I will get to that very shortly from this moment, but the main thing is to understand that all he is saying here is that his decision to resign does not revoke the bond of charity. So again, he's not talking about some indelible mark that is irrevocable. No, he's talking about the bond of charity that he has. That's not revocable. That's all he's saying. And let's look a little bit more closely to prove this point here. Okay, so the Benepapists, such as Anne Barnhart, Mark Doherty, and Dr. Matza, and so forth, I took these two sentences and just put them here, sentence 1, sentence 2, to kind of illustrate my point that the revoking does not refer to an indelible mark. So here, let's just take a close look at what these two sentences are saying. So the first sentence, the always is also forever. There can no longer be a return to the private sphere. Benedict immediately follows that by saying, my decision to resign the active exercise of the ministry does not revoke this. Well, what's the this? What's the this he's talking about? Well, what he's talking about is, does not revoke this. It refers to the previous sentence. He's saying there can no longer be a return to the private sphere. So his decision to resign the active exercise of the ministry does not revoke this. Grammatically and logically, he's referring back to there can no longer, the always is also forever, there can no longer be a return to the private sphere. So his resignation does not revoke that. And as we have just seen, the whole dialogue about the private sphere is his discussion of this bond of charity, of no longer belonging to himself and belonging to others, of having true sons and daughters and brothers and sisters in the church. So that's all he's saying, grammatically and logically. That is all he's saying. He's not referring to anything else. This cannot refer to an indelible mark because he hasn't brought it up anywhere. He's talking about a bond of charity. So the meaning is clear. What he's saying is, my decision to resign the papacy does not revoke this bond of charity. In other words, with the heart of a father who does not forsake the family bond, I'm not walking away from my love for the brothers and sisters, sons and daughters who belong to me, and I to them. So he's not forsaking the love. He may be resigning, but he's not forsaking the love. He's not revoking that. And he explains here very shortly how that's the case. I love you guys. I'm no longer going to be the Pope, but I'm still going to do something else for you guys. And what's that? Okay, so he's saying I'm resigning. I still love you. And my decision to resign does not revoke my love for you. And then he explains what that means. And that's, again, part of the beauty of his last general audience that's been warped by the Benepapists. So he says, my decision to resign the active exercise of the ministry does not revoke this bond of charity. So what does that mean? I do not return to a private life, to a life of travel, meetings, receptions, conferences, and so on. I am not abandoning the cross, but remaining in a new way at the side of the Lord. Remaining in a new way, not the old way, not as Pope, in a new way. I no longer bear the power of the office of the governance of the church. I'm not going to be Pope, but in the service of prayer I remain, so to speak, in the enclosure of St. Peter. So he's saying that I am giving up the papacy, but I still love you guys. So in the service of prayer, I remain, so to speak, in the enclosure of St. Peter. And that is a reference to remaining in the Vatican. So, and then he goes on to say, St. Benedict, whose name I bear as Pope, will be a great example for me in this. He showed us the way for life, which, whether active or passive, is completely given over to the work of God. So again, he's saying I'm not revoking my resignation of the papacy, does not revoke my bond of charity towards you guys as love. So accordingly, I am staying on in the service of you, the church, my brothers and sisters, my sons and daughters, in the service of prayer. So he's not remaining as a pope. He's just remaining in a new way beside the Lord, in a new way, not as pope, not the old way, which would be pope, and I will pray for you. That is what he is getting at. He's going to devote his life, the remainder of his life, to prayer for his sons and daughters, his brothers and sisters, for that bond of charity. Okay, so that leaves us to resolve one last outstanding question, which I said I would return to. And that is the question of the meaning of the active exercise of the ministry. Benedict says here again, my decision to resign the active exercise of the ministry does not revoke this. And the Benepapists want to say that Benedict is qualifying the ministry here. He's speaking of an active ministry. So if there's an active ministry, there's a passive ministry. So if he's giving up the active, then maybe he's retaining the passive ministry, the contemplative part of being Pope. The prayerful part of being Pope is what I think they want to say. But a couple things. One, they're saying that he's qualifying his resignation here to say active exercise of the ministry. But if you go back to the Declaratio, Benedict had no qualification in there. The money quote from the Declaratio, the only one that matters in terms of making his resignation effective, is the one where he says, I declare that I renounce the ministry of the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter. He does not say, I resign or renounce the active ministry of the Bishop of Rome, the successor of St. Peter. So there is no qualification in his resignation instrument, which is the Declaratio. So they are trying to claim this is hereby qualifying it, but it's not. The prior document is the effective instrument of his resignation. So what does Benedict mean here by active exercise of the ministry? Well, really, he goes on to tell us. He said, as we've looked at already, the always is also forever. There can be no return to the private sphere. And we've seen that refers to a bond of charity. So there's no going back on that bond of charity. And again, he underlines that by saying, my decision to resign the papacy does not revoke this, bond of charity, my loving relationship towards you, this which I have a heart of a father towards. So he's not returning to private life. He says, I no longer bear the power of the office for the governance of the church, meaning I'm no longer Pope, but in the service of prayer, I remain, so to speak, in the enclosure of St. Peter. I remain at the Vatican, and that's what he did. He goes on to say, St. Benedict, whose name I bear as Pope, will be a great example for me in this. He showed us the way of life, which, whether active or passive, is completely given over to the work of God. We hear the Benepapists say, well, Steve, here, he's saying active and passive here. So he's dividing the papacy. But what they never talk about is, what they forget, if they just go back a few words in the sentence, he says, he's speaking of, Benedict showed us a way for a life, which is either active or passive. Not an office, which is active or passive, but a life. Benedict's active life had been the papacy, and now he's resigned it. So now he's kind of into this contemplative passive mode, which he's going to be giving up towards us as a life of prayer in service of the church for a life of prayer, in a life of prayer. That's going to be his passive active part, using the example of Benedict. So again, Saint Benedict was not speaking of a papacy, which is either active or passive, or an office, which is active or passive. He's speaking of a way of life, a way for a life. which, whether active or passive, is completely given over to the work of God. So when Benedict was Pope, he had an active life, which he had given up towards the Lord fully that way. Now he has resigned, or is about to resign. This is the eve of his resignation. Now his life will now be given over as a former Pope to kind of the contemplative, passive way for life, a life of prayer. That is all that Benedict is talking about. There is no active papacy versus a passive papacy. That is all a concoction made up in the minds of the Benepapists. And then the last audience goes on for a little bit more. And then it goes on to thanking special groups that came to the last audience. I won't bother you with all that, but I would just call it this one phrase here, one couple sentences in his concluding remarks of the main part of the general audience. Because I ask you to remember me in prayers before God, and above all to pray for the cardinals who are called to do so weighty of a task, and for a new successor of the Apostle Peter. May the Lord accompany him with the light and strength of his Spirit. So again, he's looking forward to there being another Pope because he's out of here. He's resigning. He's renouncing the papacy, and now he's going to devote his life to a life of prayer. That's exactly what he said in his Declaratio, that he's going to devote his life to being one of prayer. I quoted that earlier in part 1, and this is just a continuance of that sentiment. Okay, so as we've gone along, I've given my interpretation, even as I've pointed out the Benepapist interpretation of the always is also forever. My interpretation of the key paragraphs in dispute is as follows. Benedict is telling us, Benedict is saying, one who is elected Pope belongs to the Church and the Church to him. The private dimension of his life, in a manner of speaking, is thus lost. Yet, when one receives one's life, one gives it away. In other words, the Pope truly gains brothers and sisters, sons and daughters throughout the world. The Pope becomes a father. And we've seen that, where in the general audience he spoke about a family bond with the entire Church. He spoke about having a heart of a father and keeping all in his prayers. So a Pope, so continuing on with my interpretation, a Pope always carries within himself this bond of charity, feeling secure in this embrace because he no longer belongs to himself, he belongs to all, and all belong to him. Resigning the papacy does not revoke this bond of charity, this loving attachment, as the Pope will forever, or Benedict will forever, retain that bond for all. In other words, for us in the Church. Just as with the heart of a father, he will always and forever love us, his sons and daughters. And thus, after his resignation, because he has this bond of charity, he will always continue to pray in service for his sons and daughters, in other words, the Church. So that's the meaning of the key paragraphs of the last audience. The problem for the Benepapist is that there is nothing here that is inconsistent with the view that Benedict's validity, that Benedict validly resigned. There is no need to introduce concepts that are not in the text about an indelible mark of the papacy. That stuff is a concoction of the minds, the active imagination of the Anne Barnhards and Mark Doherty's, God bless them. But it's just not found in the general audience. They want to think it is because they don't want Francis to be Pope. Now, I'm no fan of Francis as Pope, but we must be honest with ourselves, at least in terms of what the general audience is saying. There's no reason at all to posit any error by Benedict, either in his Declaratio, or any theological error in his Declaratio or in his general audience. He is not talking about an indelible mark of the papacy. He's not talking about keeping an active part or bifurcating the papacy. It's just not there. There's no reason to think Benedict intentionally created a self-impeded see, as the likes of Andrea Cianci or Estefania Costa would argue. It's just not there. It's not in the Declaratio. It's not in the general audience. The interpretation offered here in this video, in these last two videos, is free of any inserted concepts. We don't have to again, insert indelible mark, which is not there. We don't have to insert some crazy theological notion. And no assumptions are overlaid upon the text. I looked directly at what the text was saying, such as the always is also forever. It does not, as we've seen, it does not refer to an indelible mark. With regard to the act of ministry, it does not refer to a partial resignation of only the active part of the papacy. We saw in one of the previous slides that the act of ministry refers to what Benedict was saying about Saint Benedict, showing us a way for a life that is active or passive, not for a way for a papacy or for an office which is active or passive. He's talking about a way of life. Benedict is giving up in his resignation his active life as a pope or being pope. He's giving that, leaving that behind. Now he's taking on a new life as a former pope, and his life there, a passive life, contemplative life, is going to be devoted to a life of prayer and service of the church. That is all that's being talked about. So again, the interpretation that's been offered here in these videos is, I think, the common sense reading of the text. Nothing's overlaid upon it. It's common sense, and it's a natural reading of the text. Okay, so we've kind of run through all the objections already, but I'll just do them quickly here. Again, objection 1 originally was, so I'm just re-summarizing what the objections were and the answers, which I said I've given along the way, actually. So the objection, the always is also forever, is a reference to an indelible mark of the papacy in Benedict's mind. So in reply to the objection 1 first, I'd say the phrase the always is also forever is not defined. It is not a reference to an indelible mark from a papal election. That's just not there in the text at all. That is just made up. So clearly both refer to the loss of privacy or inability to return to it. In the 2 paragraphs under our closer scrutiny, the always is defined in terms of the loss of privacy, and the always is also forever is defined in terms of not being able to return to the private sphere. So everything has to do with privacy. It all has to go back to what that whole discussion in the prior paragraph was, and that loss that Benedict is referring to is belonging to all, and all belonging to him. It's about gaining sons and daughters and brothers and sisters, that he entered into this relationship with the church, with the people, not the church as an abstraction, but as a living communion of brothers and sisters and his sons and daughters. He is speaking in the same sense he spoke earlier, as I said, with the heart of the Father, speaking of a family bond, indeed, a bond of charity, I've been calling it. This theme, as we've seen, as I quoted from, was seen in other of Benedict's writings. As Cardinal Ratzinger, he talked about Pope Paul VI. He talked about, again, no longer belonging to ourselves, again, speaking from the aspect or point of view of Pope Paul VI. And then he also made some comments about not being alone in his inauguration homily when he became Pope. Thus, the always is also forever refers to a bond of charity which is forever. His resignation does not revoke it, because a father loves his kids even if he retires from the family business. He still loves his kids. He loves his brothers and sisters, his sons and daughters. So that's all he's talking about, that he's going to carry this bond with him. And because he has this bond, that even though he's no longer Pope, no longer in the active ministry, now that he's put the papacy behind him, he's now going to devote his life to a life of prayer. So this whole references to the always and forever has nothing to do with a partial resignation. It has nothing at all to do with the papal munus or anything like that continued within Benedict as an indelible mark or whatever. So in all, we can say the following regarding the Benepapist objection. We can say the objection fails. Clearly, we walk through it. Objection fails. Okay, second objection. It had to do with the line where Benedict says, "My decision to resign the active ministry of the active exercise of the ministry does not revoke this." This is to say, the indelibility of the papal ministry is irrevocable. That's what the Benepapists claim. Benedict thinks he is a pope forever, but he will now exercise only a part of the Petrine ministry. And again, we answer that as we went along, but I'll just re-summarize it. First, we saw grammatically and logically the phrase "does not revoke this" refers back to the prior sentence. And in the prior sentence, it is said, "He always is also forever. There is no return to the private sphere." So all Benedict is saying is that his resignation does not revoke the fact that he cannot go back to the private sphere. Why? Because we're talking about a bond of charity. That's why. So thus we see, as we saw in reply to objection 1, we are speaking of a bond of charity. In other words, that even though Benedict is resigning, this does not revoke this bond. He still has a heart of a father. Again, one of the things he explicitly said in the general audience. He spoke of a family bond. And these things are consistent with the Seawald interviews. And I'll show a couple selections from Seawald's interviews with Benedict here shortly. That is why his resignation of the papacy does not revoke this, because what's not revoked is he has this bond of charity towards the faithful, towards his sons and daughters, a sense of responsibility, prayerful responsibility. One does not cease having a heart of a father, even if one steps down from the papacy. Again, I'll show this in the Seawald interviews here shortly. Essentially, he is saying, I've come to love you, and resigning the papacy does not mean I will stop loving you. That's just what this is all about. Real quickly, look at a couple of Seawald's interviews with Benedict. This is from A Life, Volume 2. And here we're taking up a paragraph that I believe is in the context of speaking of the use of the title emeritus as a former pope. And here Benedict is replying to questions about that. He's saying in this formula, both things are implied. No actual legal authority any longer, meaning I'm not pope anymore, but a relationship which remains even if it's invisible. So here he's speaking, as we've seen in the general audience, this sense of a bond still. He still loves those that he came to love as Pope, right? Just because you stop being Pope doesn't mean, oh, love's gone, see you guys later. No, he has this love for them. So he goes on to say this legal spiritual formula avoids any idea of there being two popes at the same time. So he's saying there are not two popes, because I'm not a Pope anymore, because Francis is. A bishopric can only have one incumbent, but the formula of Bishop Emeritus, but he's talking about here about Pope Emeritus, but the formula also expresses a spiritual link which can never be taken away. And he's just talking about the spiritual love, this bond of charity that he has towards his sons and daughters that he does not give up. He carries that forward with him. He retains that love. He loses the papacy, he retains this love. That's all that's being said here. And then another blurb we'll take from one of the Seawald interviews. This is from Last Testament. Again, Seawald's interview with Benedict. And Seawald's question was, one objection is that the papacy has been secularized by the resignation. That is no longer a unique office, but an office like any other. Now, I'm not going to go line by line. If you want to put it on pause, you can read the whole thing, but I just wanted to point out a couple things here. Speaking about how Bishop Emeritus came to be, Benedict says, there were a number of bishops who said, I am a father, and that I'll stay, because you can't simply stop being a father. And then Benedict said, to that I must reply, even a father's role stops. Of course, a father does not stop being a father, but he is relieved of concrete responsibility. He remains a father in a deep inward sense, in a particular relationship which has responsibility, but not with the day-to-day tasks as such. It was that way also for bishops. So here again, this is consistent with the interpretation I was putting forward for the general audience, is that Benedict took on this love. He was engaged by the Lord always and forever. He developed being a father, having a spiritual bond of charity with his sons and daughters, his brothers and sisters in this church, which is not an abstraction. to live in communion. So even though he's resigning and he's no longer Pope, he still has this kind of heart of a father towards those he came to love. And that's all that he's talking about here, that you don't stop being a father. It doesn't mean you don't stop being a Pope. So that's all he is saying here. And then Benedict goes on a little bit further to say, so I think it's also clear that a Pope is no Superman, and his mere existence is not sufficient to conduct his role. Meaning because of his human weaknesses, he can't always go on being Pope. He's sick, he's ill, and in Benedict's case, he believed he was too weak to continue. Rather, he likewise exercised a function. But if he steps down, he remains in an inner sense within the responsibility he took on, but not the function, so not the office. So he has this inner sense of responsibility. Like a father always feels a responsibility to love his kids. He may have left the house, but he's always he loves them. He's always helping them any way he can through prayers or financially, materially, or whatever. He has a heart of a father to do what he can, but he is no longer, in the broad sense, the Pope. He does not have these official responsibilities anymore. It's just something he does now out of the love, this inward sense of responsibility that goes with the bond of charity that any of us have as mother, father, or a priest over a parish, or a bishop over his diocese, etc. So that's all he's talking about. So accordingly, Benedict tells us what he has meant. Again, there is no return to the private life. In other words, there's not a forgetting of the bond of charity. That's what he has meant by saying his resignation does not revoke this. It's a reference to that. Though he no longer has the power to govern the church, which he goes on to say. He doesn't have the power to govern the churches because he's not Pope. Only the Pope has the power to govern the church. Therefore, he will devote his life in the service of prayer for the church. In other words, for his sons and daughters, because he has this inward sense of responsibility because of that bond of charity that we all might feel as a father, as a mother, as a priest, as a teacher, whoever, towards those we've had a responsibility for and that we care about. So this bond of charity goes forward with him, even though he has left the papacy. He carries forward that bond of charity, and therefore he's going to continue in service of prayer for the church. All right, therefore we can say that objection 2 fails completely. All right, objection 3, our last objection. Benedict, so the objection goes, Benedict believed he could give up the power of jurisdiction or the active exercise of the papal munus. Thus, he could say, I no longer bear the power of the office for the governance of the church, yet at the same time, he believed he could maintain the power of order, inherent papal munus, and thus could immediately add, but in the service of prayer, I remain, so to speak, in the enclosure of St. Peter. Okay, so the emphasis of the Benepapist here is on active exercise, that Benedict gave up, bifurcated the papacy, giving up the active exercise, or maybe as a self-impedist Benepapist would say. Those like Cianci or Acosta might say that he stopped the doing of the papacy, but not give up the papacy itself. But that doesn't work. They're suggesting here that Benedict qualified what he gave up, right? He qualified it by saying the active papacy versus just the papacy. However, if you look at the official instrument of Benedict's resignation, the Declaratio, in it, he did not qualify his resignation to pertain to some unknown active exercise of the ministry component. He didn't do it. There's one sentence in the Declaratio that matters because it is what executes his resignation. Everything else could have been cut away. There's one sentence that had to stay in there. And that's the part where he talks about doing it of his own free will and all that. But he goes on to say, I renounce the ministry of the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter. In such a way, the See of Rome, the See of Peter will be vacant, and a new conclave is necessary to elect a new supreme pontiff. He did not say, I renounce the active ministry there. He said, I renounce the ministry. So there is no qualification. So the Benepapists are kind of reading their own interpretation of what the active ministry means here. And we'll look again. I've already discussed during this video what that really means, looking at Benedict's own words, but let me continue on here with the reply to the objection. Also in the Always is also forever paragraph, Benedict talks about that he's not abandoning the cross. He goes on to say that he stands by the cross in a new way. He doesn't say the old way. He says, I stand there in the new way, not the old way. What's the old way? Pope. So he's not standing by the cross as Pope any longer. Okay, then the Benepapists like to use this line. I'm not quite sure why, but where Benedict says, I no longer bear the power of the office for the governance of the church. And they'll use that to suggest that, see, he's given up a part. He's given up the power, but he hasn't given up the office, which, come on, this is ridiculous. The phrase, I no longer bear the power of the office for the governance of the church is proof of nothing in favor of Benepapism, because that statement is perfectly consistent with an interpretation involving a valid resignation, which I do believe Benedict made a valid resignation, but that phrase is equally defensible by, or more defensible by the thesis that Benedict's resignation was valid. He doesn't have the power of office anymore because he's no longer Pope. So that's no proof of Benepapism. Okay, so let's just return to the Benepapists where they talk about an active ministry, or Benedict's decision to resign the active exercise of the ministry, where they suggest that that means that he's qualifying his resignation, that he's only giving up like the doing of the papacy, or only giving up like the active munus, or the administration of the papacy, but still maintaining the munus in some sense, in some indelible sense, that in his mind keeps him a pope in some way, even after he resigns, and that's his error, etc. But that's not the case. We can see by reading the Always is Forever paragraph that Benedict, for Benedict, the active ministry has reference to Benedict XVI's point later on in that same paragraph about Saint Benedict, his namesake. He talks about Saint Benedict, who showed us the way for a life which is active or passive, is completely given over to the work of God. Benedict speaks of a way of life, which is active or passive. He's not speaking of a papacy or a papal munus or a ministry, which is active or passive. Again, that's the Benepapists reading in the interpretation when, again, it's clear that Pope Benedict XVI is talking about Saint Benedict, talking about a way of life, which is whether it's active or passive. That's given over to the work of God. So Benedict XVI is essentially saying, or did say in this paragraph, what he means is by resigning the active ministry, active exercise of the ministry, he's referring to giving up his active life as being a pope, as being an active bishop in the life of the church. He has resigned that. He's renounced that. He's put it behind him now that he's going now into his life starting February 28th as a former pope, and his new life, now passive, now contemplative, will be given over to the work of God in the form of prayer, full time. So that is all he's talking about. There's the way of life between active and passive has nothing to do with the papal ministry or munus. He's talking about a way of life, and his life has changed from being a pope to not being pope. So that's why he talked about being remaining by the Lord in a new way, which is not being pope. So that's all that's being discussed here. And then returning to just to one of my replies in the first part of, or part one of this video series, the Benepapist interpretation of the general audience contradicts normas non nullas. And you recall that's the some of the changes that Benedict made to conclave rules. He issued that on February 22nd, actually about 5 days before the general audience. And it's clear, and I refer you back to part one of the series, there's no bifurcation as possible by looking at that. It's clear that Benedict had in mind is that the one who's elected Supreme Pontiff has full and supreme authority in the Church. There is no place in the verbiage or the doctrine for someone having a little bit of the papal authority left over. It's just not there. Clearly, Benedict expected a new true pope because he would no longer be it. So I refer you back to part 1 for the details on that. Okay, then just the last reply here to this objection. I refer back to Benedict's words to the pilgrims from Albano on February 28th. So this is the actual day that Benedict resigned, the effective date of his resignation, which was at 8 p.m. So I think it was around 5:30. So about 2.5 hours before his resignation, he made these comments. And in those comments, as greeting to these pilgrims, Benedict said explicitly, "I am no longer the Supreme Pontiff as of 8 p.m. this evening." So these comments are contemporaneous, or nearly so, like the day after the general audience. And they directly contradict the Benepapist interpretation of the last audience, which wants you to believe that there was some indelible mark that he was remaining pope. But here he clearly said, "I am no longer the Supreme Pontiff." Mark Darkety, a close associate of Anne Barnhart, admits this is a contradiction. So, I mean, to be a Benepapist, you have to kind of throw out normis non nullis. You have to throw out his comments to the pilgrims from Albano in order to kind of construct your narrative that you're kind of ignoring and excluding evidence, which is not the way to go about trying to understand what Benedict is actually saying. So what can we say about this objection overall? So as with objection 1 and 2, objection 3 fails. We can fail them all 3 of them, with extreme prejudice. Okay, just some quick remarks to summarize. The Benepapists have imposed their ideas upon the last audience. That's clear. The always is also a forever does not refer to an indelible mark of a papal election or the papal munus upon Benedict at some deep ontological level. It is clearly a reference to a bond of charity. When Benedict talks about the resignation does not revoke this, grammatically and logically, this refers back to the bond of charity as we discussed. It does not refer back to an indelible, irrevocable papal office or munus or whatever. When Benedict speaks of the act of ministry, of his resignation not revoking the active exercise of the ministry, this is ultimately in a reference to his discussion later on in that same paragraph of Saint Benedict, where he talks about Saint Benedict showing us that a way of life, whether active or passive, can be dedicated to God. So so Benedict XVI, referencing Saint Benedict, is talking about a way of life. He's not talking about a way of a papacy that is active or passive. It's a way of life. And Benedict has given up his life as Pope, and now he's dedicating his life as former Pope to a life of prayer. That is the meaning. So in the end here, a valid resignation easily explains the last audience. It can be read in light of the thesis that Benedict's resignation was valid. There's no need to introduce all these extrinsic elements to the text, such as preconceived notions of indelible marks of the papacy or jurisdiction of power, as such as like Dr. Matza reads into it. This interpretation that I have offered here is consistent with other contemporaneous documents or words of Benedict himself. None have to be discarded, as the Benepapists must do. So my reading of the last audience is perfectly consistent with what Benedict said in the Declaratio. It's consistent with his change to the conclave rules on February 22nd, and it's consistent with what Benedict said on February 28th, just a couple hours before he resigned, where he said, "I will no longer be the Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church." So we don't have to exclude evidence. The Benepapists must exclude evidence or come up with some very odd explanations for it, such as the Ratzinger Code, and that's an entire different subject. But I have articles on that, and I'll probably at some point do a video on that as well. So the explanation offered here in my reply and in my interpretation of the last audience is a far more simpler, more natural interpretation, which is consistent with the text and context, And it's also consistent with things that Benedict had said before about belonging, about loss of privacy, not being alone as Pope. It's also consistent with his interviews with Peter Seewald. So there's no reason to bring in all these kind of crazy ideas that the Benepapists do. Okay, real quick here, just some resources to use against the Benepapists. So you can just put that on pause if you want to read those to yourself. Okay, so that concludes episode 9 on the Always is Also Forever. So that's the end of part 2 of 2. This will be my longest video. I appreciate you guys for who've stuck it out this long, but I think it was important to discuss the Always is Also Forever in some detail, because it is in some ways one of the launching pads for Benepapism. That they use Benedict's words here to start concocting a chain of other false conclusions and premises based upon that. So it was important to dispel and refute the Benepapists on the last audience. In terms of what's next at this moment, I'm not sure what the next episode will be. Probably a Benepapist related one. I certainly am open to suggestions. You can find my email on my blog. If you go there, look in the About section, or maybe at the bottom of one of my articles, you'll find ways to contact me. So feel free to do so, and let me know what aspect of Benepapism you might want to have me address. So again, thank you for your time and attention. If you like this video, please hit the like button. If you can, subscribe as well. If you don't like it, don't subscribe, and hit the down button. Thank you again.